Well, good afternoon, everyone. So let me ask you something. Has it been a good conference so far? Yeah? How many of you were surprised by what you saw with Silverlight yesterday in the keynote? Were surprised by the managed code component, the CLR in the browser? Was that news to you, or had the information been leaked? Yeah? Anyone surprised? Well, very, very cool stuff. I look at what happened yesterday, all the announcements that were made, and I really think that yesterday changed the way the web is programmed. And I think we're going to look back on yesterday, and we're going to look at that as a watershed day in the history of the browser and of web-based applications. So let me introduce myself real quickly. My name is Jeff Procyse. I work for Wintellect. Standing to my left here is Matt Gibbs. He works for Microsoft. He's a program or development manager at Microsoft, and he happens to be one of the guys who built ASP.NET AJAX, and his involvement with that continues today. Matt, do you think that anyone's interested in ASP.NET AJAX anymore?
I think so.
Well, at least the room's not empty. More importantly, do you think we can throw some really cool stuff at these folks that is exciting as what they've seen with Silverlight?
I think so. I think going forward, people will continue to see ASP.NET and AJAX and Silverlight, and as they come together. It's actually funny, I have to tell you, things we heard last year at MIX, as well as some comments I heard this year at MIX. I put on the slide Development Manager for ASP.NET, but a comment I had today and then a question we got asked last year I have to share with you. I started with working on at Microsoft 10 years ago on something that we now call Classic ASP, and have been working on our web platform ever since. The name of our group, actually we don't even call internally ASP.NET anymore. We call it the UI Framework and Services team. I got asked yesterday if the ASP.NET team should be somehow involved in what was going on with Silverlight, which made me smile because I also got asked a year ago if the AJAX team I was working on should get in touch with the ASP.NET team. A few years ago, I got asked if the ASP.NET team should be working closely with the ASP team to kind of see what the technologies were doing there. People seem to, outside Microsoft, lose sight of the fact that it's one team that has been working on this platform and how we bring things together. In Classic ASP, it was HTML and a scripting engine and how we could make these work better to access data. In ASP.NET, we have a declarative programming model and how you can leverage managed code. In AJAX, we're trying to better leverage JavaScript on the client. And now with Silverlight, we're seeing that we can leverage managed code and Silverlight on the client as well. So
cool. It's
our team, and I think what people have seen is we've made some good moves forward with ASP.NET AJAX, and now we're moving forward again with Silverlight. So.
Excellent. So before you jump into the slides, let me give you a quick preview of what we're going to do here today. The title of this session is Go Deep with AJAX. I'm sorry, it's Go Deep with AJAX. So what we're going to do is go into ASP.NET AJAX. We're going to peel the covers back. We're going to show you some really cool stuff about how it works. We're going to show you some best practices. We're going to show you some stuff that hopefully you didn't know before. More importantly, we're going to describe why, if like a lot of developers today, you're primarily using Update Panel and some of those other controls on the server, you're really missing out on the most powerful features of ASP.NET AJAX. So you're going to learn more about how it works, how it's put together. You're going to learn about how we work the magic on the client side with JavaScript. And more importantly, everything that we've prepared for you today, we've done with one goal in mind. We not only want to enrich your knowledge of ASP.NET AJAX, but we want to put a very practical bent on it so that you can go back to your offices later this week or next week and use what you learned in this session to build better ASP.NET AJAX applications. Now, we are going to spend just a little bit of time on Update Panel, not the standard stuff, but show you some Update Panel optimizations. But after that, it's pedal to the metal. We're going to drop down mostly to the client side, show you some really cool stuff there, and again, hopefully show you some stuff that will make you a better ASP.NET AJAX programmer. So, we have a couple of slides put together, although we're not doing many slides, right?
We really have, I think, a total of 5 slides, and you've already seen 2 of them. So
yeah. Can we make that 4?
Right along. Can we make it 4?
Yeah.
we can skip showing them the please fill out your eval slide. Does everyone promise to fill out your evaluation form?
Very good.
All right. We now have 4 slides. So on to slide number 3.
That's a 20% productivity increase right there.
All right. We're going deep, making things faster.
Let's start going deep.
Here's our most complicated slide. This is the ASP.NET AJAX architecture slide. Now, how many people are using, and I won't do a lot of the kind of show your hands thing, but this is one we probably should understand. How many people are already using the update panel? Most, but not all. Okay, so we'll see a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So a couple key things to note about this slide, and we'll dig into quite a bit of it as we move forward. Just interrupt me here. I'll cover kind of some of the things, and then we'll move forward from there. A lot of times you'll see an architecture slide on ASP.NET, and it really goes into a lot of detail on everything that you see on the right side here on the server. We don't typically talk about everything that's going on the client, because in the past we've had like a do post back function and a few other things that we don't talk about. Now with the AJAX architecture, we're doing a lot more on the client and have opened it up to make it easier to write JavaScript. Because we love JavaScript? No. Because we found that to really do what you need to do in the browser and do it more effectively and efficiently, we need to make it easier to do JavaScript. So on the server, we have ASP.NET 2.0 on the bottom, and then we've built up AJAX extensions on that with server controls, better ways of doing asynchronous communications for you. And then, of course, you have ASMX services on the top. In the client, notice that we call out several different browsers. So we've made a large effort in order to ensure that when you're doing AJAX development, it just works cross-platform, cross-browser. There's layers in the AJAX library that allow you to do asynchronous communications. There's a core library and a base class library that give you things you're familiar with in .NET framework programming, similar to string formatting, web request handling, abstractions for the differences in web service access. And on top of that, there's easier ways of doing script proxies, managing XHTML, CSS, and manipulating the DOM. That's kind of the top-level overview.
Kind of the basics. And by the way, we're going to be spending a fair amount of time in that block on the left-hand side labeled Base Class Library. That is a library, actually comprised of multiple files of classes written in JavaScript, no less. It's not documented because it's technically part of the ASP.NET AJAX Futures CTP. Chances are, over time, some of those features, maybe many of them, will be rolled into the core platform. But because they're not documented, they don't get a lot of press, and yet there are some incredible, incredible features in there that can allow us to build much, much richer browser-based UIs today if we use those features than if we go it without them. So we will be spending quite a bit of time over there. We're going to talk a little bit more about that asynchronous communications layer. If you've never looked at what goes over the wire, when you do an AJAX callback to an ASMX endpoint, for example, we're going to look at exactly what goes over the wire. We're going to see that it's not XML unless you explicitly tell the framework to send XML. Instead, it's JSON, JavaScript Object Notation. So, with that said, is there another slide, or should we start our first demo?
We should move on to demos. First, I would like to talk a little bit more about the futures. A couple of things of clarification there. There's been a little bit of confusion in the past about the futures release, as we call it. Part of the reason there hasn't been enough documentation is not just that it's been in our futures package. It's been just limited time and resources in order to get the futures items documented. Yesterday, a new release, a new build of our futures went out. It's got new controls that target, and you saw them in the keynote demo, that target Silverlight, make it easy to drag and drop an ASP control on a page, start using Silverlight, show video, skin it in different ways, this kind of thing. What we've really liked about the futures package is that we get great feedback from people. They try it out, they give us feedback, and we still have flexibility because it's not fully part of the release yet in order to respond very quickly to the feedback we get. One of the downsides of this has been that as we respond to things, we change things. So it's kind of a two-edged sword in that there's also been feedback of, hey, wait, I really liked this part about it, and now you changed it. Like, okay, you liked it, 3 other people liked it, and 96% of the rest of the people that used it hated it. So it's been a little bit tough to walk the line there and identify exactly what the right investments are in the futures. But we've really liked the kind of feedback we've gotten there. part of the documentation, even yesterday, has been improved as we go along and have more time. So there's a set of quick starts, brand new there, that a lot of the base class library stuff has been addressed. So the documentation that was not where it should be 3 months ago has improved even there, just from our own PMs that have been working on it and saying, oh, I've had 10 questions on this, I'm going to write 25 examples for it and put it in the future. So keep working on the futures, take a look at it, and please continue sending us your feedback. It's been, gives us a lot of license to really focus our efforts and evolve things in the ways that you guys tell us to. So we've really enjoyed it. So on to demos. That's our last slide.
Cool. So I'll do the first one. If we can switch over to the XP machine on the screen, please. We will dive into our first one here. So let me show you this. I said we would say just a little bit about Update Panel, but this is about all we're going to say about it. I want to show you a little demo here that will allow me to make a very, very important point to you about Update Panel and about optimizations. You're looking at a sample site here, which we can make available to you. We call it the Burton Demo site. It's actually an ASP.NET AJAX mock-up with some extra bells and whistles of a real live website that sits today at www.burton.com. Burton, of course, is the world's leading snowboard manufacturer. They make all kinds of cool equipment. We helped them build a site a year ago. We used what was then known as Atlas in it, and with their permission, we have subsetted some of that, and we now use that to demonstrate ASP.NET AJAX today. One of the pages in this demo site is one that we call the tech page, and it's sort of a gateway into the real tech section at therealburton.com, where you can go to learn more about their products. Now, when you click around this page here, whoops, wrong one. Let's go back. When I click these other links on the page, notice that a lot of content on the page is updating. When I click these links at the top, for example, everything on the page is updating. When I click down here, on the other hand, only one small part of the page is updating. Now, not surprisingly, I'm using Update Panel controls on this page to convert what would have been ASP.NET postbacks into asynchronous XML HTTP requests, also known as AJAX callbacks. That's why we're getting the smooth, flicker-free, scroll-free updates that you see. Now, interestingly enough, I don't have just one Update Panel on this page. I have 4 of them. One of them comprises or encapsulates most everything at the top of the page, everything you see in this splash graphic. There's another one that basically owns all the content from this left quadrant of the page down, another one around this additional photos element, and yet another one down below that additional photos element. Now, what's interesting about this is, as you can see from the outside, it works, and it works just fine. But unfortunately, when you use multiple Update Panel controls on a page, you need to think about what's going over the wire and about what's executing on the server. Because if I could view wire traffic here, and if I could profile the code executing on the server, I would see I'm sending a lot of data back and forth that I don't need to be sending. I would also see that I am unnecessarily executing code on the server. So, in situations where you're using Update Panel and you have more than one on the page, let me show you an easy and very cool optimization that you can make. It turns out, if we go into the source here, as I said, there are 4 Update Panel controls on the page. Update Panel has a property named Update Mode, which you can set to one of 2 values, always or conditional. The default is always, which simply means that if one Update Panel control on that page goes back to the server to update, all of the other Update Panels on that page update as well. That means all of the other Update Panels by default execute rendering code to render the content that they own. It also means that we're stuffing additional data into the HTTP response, the actual content rendered out by those Update Panel controls. Now, although it works, in most cases that's not what you want. In the example I just showed you, when one of those links in the Update Panel at the top of the page is clicked, I do want the other Update Panels updating because I want content to change elsewhere on the page. But in all the other Update Panels on the page, like the one around that additional photos element, I don't want an update by that Update Panel to cause other Update Panels to update too. Why? Because it's only the content in that one Update Panel that needs to change. So here's what I'm going to do. Again, this is something you should think about anytime you host multiple Update Panels on a page. I'm going to go to each of my Update Panels, and I'm going to add an update mode equals conditional property. What conditional says is, by default, this update panel is no longer going to update itself automatically just because another update panel on the page went back to the server. Let's grab that little bit of markup there, and we'll apply it to the other update panels as well. I think I saw another one there. Maybe I did not. Let's go down. Here is the second update panel. If we go a little bit further down, we'll find another one. This is the one surrounding the additional photos element. And down towards the bottom, we'll find one more. Just do a sophisticated search here to find it. Here it is. Here's the fourth and final update panel. Now, let's go back and rerun that page. Let me first close down the instance of it that's running already. We'll restart the app. We'll go over to the tech page. And we're going to test and make sure that everything still works as we intended for it to work. For example, when I click right here, indeed, you can see that I'm getting the update that I want, a very localized update. But what happens when I click one of these links up here? Unfortunately, we still have some work to do. Notice that the content below this update panel on the page isn't changing. Why? Because those update panels are no longer updating by default. So here's the second part of this equation. When you have multiple update panel controls on a page, you should set their update mode properties to conditional. But if there are situations where you want an update from one update panel to cause updates in others, you can explicitly call those other update panels update methods. We can do that in a C# and VB and whatever, in the code behind class and whatever language we're using. So what I'm going to do is this to finish this out. Here is the code behind class for the page. You can see that I have 3 lines of code commented out. These are lines of code that execute when the uppermost update panel updates. These lines of code cause the other 3 update panels to update as well. Now, the only time we'll have multiple update panels updating is when that upper update panel is updated. So with that, let's go back once more. Let's verify that the user experience is what we want it to be. Notice that now, when I click one of these links up here, content below it does change, yet we still get very localized updates right here. Now, let me do one more thing to sort of drive this home. I'm going to bring up Nikhil Katari's Web Development Helper, which is one of my favorite tools for working with ASP.NET AJAX. We're going to enable HTTP logging so we can see what happens when an XML HTTP request goes back to the server. If I click one of these links, here is the XML HTTP request. Here is the response that came back. And using Nikhil's tool, I can see all the update panels that actually re-rendered on the server. And you can see here there are 4 of them, which is what we intended, because one updated because a trigger fired, the other 3 updated because we told them to by calling their update methods. But let's do this. Let's clear out that log. Let's click one of these links a little bit further down, grab its XML HTTP request, and if we look in the response there, only one update panel updated. What did that do for me? It means I'm executing less code on the server. I'm not executing rendering code that doesn't need to execute. It also means I'm being more efficient on the wire because I'm sending back less data. Again, if you use multiple update panel controls on a page, think about this. By default, you should probably set their update mode properties to conditional. If and only if you want one update panel to cause another to update, explicitly call the latter update panel's update method. Okay, now back to Matt's machine.
Bring it back.
And now back to Matt's machine. Not there yet. So let me just say another word about Update Panel while we're switching over there. I'll tell you the thing you really ought to know about Update Panel. What I just showed you is low-hanging fruit. There was nothing super deep or super technical about that. What a lot of folks don't know is that most of the intelligence for Update Panel is not in the Update Panel control. Most of the intelligence is in a little client-side JavaScript class named Page Request Manager. It's implemented in a JavaScript file named Microsoft AJAX Webforms.js. Now, the reason that we wanted to bring your attention to that, oh good, I see you're up and running there, is that when it comes to doing advanced customizations of Update Panel and optimizations, generally you can't do them on the server. But once you know that it's actually a Page Request Manager object in JavaScript on the client that's making Update Panel's magic work, all of a sudden, all sorts of interesting and very useful customizations become possible.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, one of the things that Jeff calls out is that a lot of the guts of the work that happen for AJAX rendering and controls actually takes place on the client. So one of the things that you may have noticed on the page that Jeff was looking at was the use of a script manager. So in this case, we have a script manager proxy. What the script manager gives us, and we're using a master page here, so we have a script manager proxy that communicates with a global script manager. The script manager takes care of rendering out the scripts we need, as well as taking care of one single page request manager on the page. That page request manager essentially runs interference for everything else that needs to happen for AJAX on the client. Anytime there's an update panel on the server page, it corresponds to something in the client that is going to initiate requests, interact with the script manager, and coordinate asynchronous requests. You can have multiple pieces of client script trying to instantiate web requests and communicate with the server. They all go through the page request manager. It coordinates canceling requests for you, and tracking responses. Now I'm getting other weird resolution.
Yeah, actually it looks kind of good. Just have to do a lot of scrolling there, huh?
That's better. Okay, so in this example, what we're going to do is potentially just eliminate the need to go back to the server altogether. So we have script code for our update confirm page, where we have on the client, here in our JavaScript, and you see that using the JavaScript libraries that we have in AJAX, we grab a page request manager using namespaces just like you'd expect to use in C# or VB on the server. So we grab a page request manager, there's a single instance, and we add an initialize request method to it. So our initialize request handler sets a cancel method, and in this case, although you probably never would do it this way, we ask the user, are you sure you want to go back to the server asynchronously? And when we run the page, before we go back to the server at all, the user gets the option to cancel it. And all this from, if we say cancel, the event is canceled, no communication happens. So I think that's, again, probably even a better optimization if we just avoid talking to the server at all.
Anytime you can avoid those servers, it's a good thing.
Now, the page request manager itself actually exposes 5 different methods that you can kind of interfere with easily this way. There's initialize request, begin request, end request. There's page loading and page loaded. Now, a couple of things that come up commonly as people are looking at this is, how do I tell when this request is about to start which update panel is the one that's triggered this request to start, so I can figure out what I need to do? In this case, we just have this one panel we're dealing with, so we know what's happening, and we can just pop up our dialog box. In reality, right now, the way to do it is that you can't. There's a good reason for this, and we've looked at a couple of options for making some ways to tie into this better in the future. But the problem is that because when the request goes back to the server, anything on the server can update. You can call, just as Jeff did, said, I don't want to explicitly update another one, or I do want to update another one. Then when the initial request is triggered on the client, you don't really know from update panel A starting a refresh if update panel B is going to be updated. So at this point, we've backed off from trying to provide information that may not ultimately be accurate. So we're looking at options to complicate the API a little bit more, so you can say this is the beginning trigger DOM element and it corresponds to something in this update panel, but ultimately it may not be the one responsible. Any of these events you can tie into and start manipulating what's happening. The other pattern to notice here is that in this case there's a single instance. You only get one page request manager per page, but you can instantiate some things like web requests, get an instance on your own, new one up, start making out-of-band requests yourself, and those wouldn't funnel through the same way, but they would go through, again, a central kind of object where you could tie in and say, oh, I want to talk, I want to interfere with all communications with the server and provide a central request. One other thing, and Jeff, I think, always gets a chuckle out of this, is that people found that it was so easy to start managing the way people were updating content on a page that the kind of pattern that customers were used to, where they would click on something and the screen would flash and go blank and then the page would update and they knew something was happening, they found that all of a sudden people were clicking on things where they were used to something flashing and there was new info and they didn't get anything. Jeff actually told me about a customer calling him up and saying, my end users are now very confused because they'll click and something updates and they don't know it happened. So can you please just bring back a little flash? Just something short and brief. Call up those guys you work with at Microsoft and tell them to bring back just a short one. So Jeff, being ever accommodating, easy guy to work with, gave them an alternative. Said, we can still get all the advantages of update panel, but we'll give you just a little bit of a flash. And he did that, again, using AJAX, so we should take a quick look at the code. It is important to note here that this was something done in custom code and not something that's part of the AJAX framework. So in the update highlight code, what Jeff's done is, again, go to the page request manager, added a page loaded event handler this time using one of the other 5 events. And when the control is updated, he's called his flash panel helper with an argument of 3 and gone in and toggled the visibility very briefly so that the customer who didn't notice that the image had changed is now alerted to the change that's happening.
And you have my permission to use that in the next version of ASP.NET AJAX if you want to.
This might be something that we would put out in a shared source way.
Where there's no accountability, right? By the way, you could change that 3 passed into the flash panels function to 300, and the thing will flash 300 times.
Maybe we should do that.
Yeah. Maybe we should switch away monitors before we do that, huh?
Maybe I should update my driver. Maybe while it's doing that, that'd be a good point to talk really quickly about, some of the shared source stuff we have been doing. One thing we did do that some people noticed and were really excited about, and other people hadn't noticed it yet, was when we released ASP.NET AJAX 1.0, we also released, without enough fanfare, because I was actually really proud of our ability to do this, one of the first projects at Microsoft to be able to do this, we released the PDBs for the framework on www.asp.net, which means you can install ASP.NET AJAX on your dev machine, and you can, or server, and put the PDBs on there, and if there's something you're trying to debug in your code or ours, then you can step directly, you can set a breakpoint in your code and step directly from your code right into my code, and then you can send me a mail and say, I see a bug that you've introduced in the AJAX framework. So no longer do you end up with this mystery of, I'm transitioning from my code into something I can't see. You can trace right into our code and see what's going on, and send us feedback that way as well. So you don't need to be, everyone looks at our code anyway using Reflector. This just takes it to the next step where you can go ahead and debug right through it. So we're very proud of our ability to get that code right out into people's hands. So
excellent. So if we can go back to my machine now, the XP box. So what Matt showed you there, Page Request Manager is the client-side identity of Update Panel. Each time that page is refreshed, whether it's because it has been requested for the first time in the browser or because an update panel is going back to the server to update, Page Request Manager fires a series of events. By hooking into those events in JavaScript, we can make advanced customizations like you saw there. There are other reasons you might want to do that too. For example, did you know Page Request Manager doesn't allow overlapping update panel updates? If you click a button in one update panel causing it to go back to the server with an AJAX callback, and before that callback completes, you click another button in another update panel, the first one gets canceled. There may be situations where you would like to prioritize those callbacks going up from your update panels, and by hooking into those client-side events fired by Page Request Manager, you can do that. But we're going to go back to the XP machine now, and I'm going to show you how to do completely without update panel. Let me show you what I consider one of the most important best practices that you should know about in ASP.NET AJAX. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you another page in the Burton demo application called the catalog request page. This is a knockoff of the real catalog request page on the real Burton site. I can go here, enter my name, my address, a few other pieces of information, and Burton will mail me a catalog that I can browse through and use to order those fine Burton products. But we've added some bells and whistles into this demo version that don't even appear on the real site. One of them is this. Notice that I have typed a zip code into the zip code box. Microsoft zip code, as a matter of fact. When I click the auto button, watch what happens in the city and state fields. They get filled in automatically. Now, I could have used an update panel to make that happen, but I did not, because this page has quite a bit of view state that it generates in each request. And remember, another dirty little secret of update panel is that when it calls back to the server, it transmits view state and everything else. In fact, there's very, very little difference between what update panel puts on the wire in an HTTP request and a normal ASP.NET postback. So I took a completely different approach to this to make it as lean and mean and efficient as I possibly could. That approach involved an AJAX web service. One of the ways that ASP.NET AJAX gives you to fire off asynchronous XML HTTP requests to your server is it allows you to expose AJAX web methods, and in the future WCF web methods, as AJAX endpoints. So what I did is built and deployed a simple AJAX file with a little method that I can call from JavaScript on the client to input the zip code that the user typed and get back a city and a state. And then I used a little bit of hand-coded JavaScript to implement this functionality that you just saw. It was a little bit more work on my part, but again, about 3 orders of magnitude more efficient on the wire, and I'll prove that to you in just a moment. Before we look at what actually goes out over the wire, let me show you what this code looks like. First, in the catalog request page, I declared a service reference. I'm sure most people in the room know what this is. When I declare a service reference to an AJAX in this way in ASP.NET AJAX, an asynchronous JavaScript proxy for that web service is generated on the server and downloaded to the client. Now, in JavaScript code of my own, I can call through that proxy and call AJAX web methods in that web service. Here's the actual JavaScript code that's making all this work. Basically here, I use some classes in PreviewScript.js that help me abstract the browser DOM to wrap around the DOM elements I'm interacting with. In this case, I'm wrapping an ASP.NET AJAX text box object around that input control that the user typed the zip code into. Here, I fire off the call to the web service, inputting the zip code, asking for a city and state in return. That is by nature an asynchronous call. Therefore, the second parameter that I passed into this method is the name of the JavaScript function that I want called in my browser when this async callback returns. Well, here is that function. What this returns is a 2-element JavaScript string array. One of those elements is the city, the other is the state. Once again, I use some abstractions available to me only on the client in ASP.NET AJAX and make the city and state appear in the browser window. So, the cool thing about Update Panel, it completely insulates you from JavaScript. Here, I had to write some JavaScript. Obviously, this is a little bit more work. I won't take the time to show you what actually goes over the wire if I used an Update Panel here, but remember, it would be a lot of stuff because it would include view state and everything else. Watch what goes over the wire when I do my updates this way. I'm going to once more bring up Nikhil Kothari's Web Development Helper tool. I will enable HTTP logging, and I'll go back again and click that auto button. Here is the asynchronous XML HTTP request to my web method that went up. When you look at what went up in the body of the request, there's no view state, there's no anything that's unnecessary, just the 5 digits that the user typed plus the parameter name. If you look at what came back in the response, we'll look at it in raw text view. What you're looking at is a JSON encoded 2-element JavaScript string array. Literally 3 orders of magnitude less data is traveling over the wire here, up and down, because instead of using update panel, I replaced that with a little bit of hand-coded AJAX that took advantage of the fact that I can make asynchronous callbacks to ASMX endpoints on my server. Now, I'm not trying to bash update panel too much, because the truth is update panel is still more efficient and definitely delivers a better user experience than allowing a page to fully post back. But when efficiency matters most to you and you want to go the extra mile, think about doing something like this instead of those update panels and make it just as efficient as you possibly can. Now, take one question. We're going to try to leave some time at the end, by the way, but let's go ahead and take this one. Yes, sir?
I just want you hard-coded the control name in the JavaScript in the client side?
I hard-coded the control name, yes. And it was a mangled name, right?
Well, regardless, what if the control was dynamically injected to the page? What is the JavaScript way of the client side?
So the question is, there in my JavaScript, when I put a text box wrapper around that input element, I hard-coded the ID of that control. And the question is, what's a JavaScript way? What if I'm assigning an ID dynamically? What I typically do, and Matt, if you do something different, just let us know, I will then dynamically generate that JavaScript from server-side ASP.NET code. So it's probably not as seamless as you want, but that's the way we do it.
It's been one of the most confusing things for people over the years, the distinction between unique ID and client ID, and which am I supposed to use when and where. Why do you mangle these names? We made a change between version 1.1 and version 2.0 in how we render the names for XHTML compliance, and it was painful to the point where we let people easily with the config switch roll back to non-XHTML compliant rendering just because so many people had been using hard coding the client IDs that were generated. Instead of dynamically saying, oh, I need the client ID, I'll use the client ID and dynamically generate the JavaScript. The way to do it is to generate the JavaScript that you want to use, and then you're assured that whatever it ends up being, you have the right one there. So Jeff's right, that's what we recommend doing. We don't anticipate changing the algorithm for generating those, but that's just in case. That's the way to do it. So.
All right, I'm going to hand it back over to you and your box there, Matt.
Okay. One other thing to note, not to, that it's bashing the update panel to talk about better ways to do it. It has been an evolution. The client callback feature of version 2.0 of ASP.NET lets you do easily some of the same out-of-band communications. They didn't round trip all of view state. Instead, what they did was they one-way traveled view state back up to the server, which caused its own set of complications in that we would do an abbreviated lifecycle execution of the page on the server, and you got all of your restored view state, but if you were updating view state, you were now in trouble because we weren't going to send it back down and carry it back up again. So this made for some very unique things for our own controls where they wanted to actually round trip view state, but we didn't support it natively. So if you watch the traffic for some of our own controls like grid view that do actually round trip view state using client callbacks, what they do is they take the client callback feature and then they introduce their own new hidden field in order to track the deltas between the view state that's being updated and what's being round tripped for them in the full post back. So you get client callbacks, you get AJAX update panel callbacks, then you can do more efficient. When you know you don't have to really change any state, then you can get orders of magnitude improvements in perf by just going directly for the data you want. So it's not bashing, it's just degrees of what you're after.
It's enlightening, right?
Yes.
Is the client callback continuing to exist just for backward compatibility, or?
There's no talk of removing it. It really is just kind of a different scenario. However, realistically, for most people, if they're going to go ahead and send it up, there's not. If you're going through the overhead of pushing it up, you can probably suffer the overhead of it coming back down on an asynchronous call. But because you may want to be updating it if you're going to push it up. It may have been a little short-sighted not to say, oh, we should go ahead and push it back down anyway. But there's no reason to remove it now. We're not looking at deprecating it or anything. Okay. If you had to guess that the reason we ended up with object-oriented paradigms for JavaScript on the client, and you thought that it was because the developers and program managers and test folks got together in a room and said, we love JavaScript and we think it needs object-oriented approaches, you would be wrong. The reality is that there were a few hallway discussions that shouldn't be repeated in front of young children about how much fun people were having with JavaScript, and coming from a more object-oriented background. And really what ended up happening was we just kind of ended up building it because we liked object-oriented programming more than we liked dynamic language programming. So what I would like to do here is just walk you through a couple of brief examples of how we ended up with essentially a couple of patterns that we use regularly that let you bring object-oriented programming like you'd see in C#, VB.NET, C++ even, bring it to JavaScript, and have a little bit less of a paradigm shift when you're moving back and forth between languages. And if my machine cooperates better than it has been, then I'll even be bold enough to just say, let's just add new pages and code from scratch. Well, with a little drag and drop. So this first example we'll do just without involving ASP.NET. We'll just do an HTML page. I have a little piece of JavaScript here that we'll drag in, which looks to be more than I anticipated. No, that's it. So if we walk through this, this is just JavaScript, but it's following kind of a pattern that we use. Say we have a person object. It's a function. It assigns a member underscore name, which we just use a convention to mean it's private. It assigns it whatever was passed in. Well, it looks like a constructor. Now we go to something in JavaScript called the prototype, which means we're modifying the object type itself. And we say that there's something called getName, which looks like a property accessor. We say that it's a function, and it returns that private variable. Okay, that looks like what you'd expect regular, using that syntax. We created a type with the getName accessor. And now I can new it up. I pass in a constructor, a parameter to the constructor, and I can say, go ahead and on that instance I've created, call it. If I save that, I don't have it in a menu here, but we can just type it in. And that's just JavaScript running. So a couple of things. If you go search on the web for JavaScript prototype and the other way that the pattern that people use a lot called closure, you will see hundreds of people debating the pros and cons of prototype versus closure. And indeed, if you go back and look at some of the early things we were doing, we were using closure heavily early on, and then ultimately switched over to prototype. And you'll see heated debates on the pros and cons of doing this. We did a lot of investigation into performance and the ability to support better debugging scenarios. Ultimately, for us, prototype won out in overall scenarios. You can find cases where the closure syntax, which is a little different, you have anonymous functions, is faster. But you can also find counterexamples where prototype is faster. Ultimately, the case that won out for us is when you're trying to debug it, if they're anonymous functions, it becomes something that is horrible to do. And prototype makes it much, much better for debugging purposes. And given that in several dominant browsers that may not be close to home doing a very good job with prototype, then we felt it was still safe to go with prototype. Leave it at that. Moving on, before I get myself in trouble. So if we add a new item here that's an ASPX page, we'll call this OOP2. We'll drag in a little more complicated example. I'll put it right after the body, and then I'll show you why in just a minute. Now, in this case, if I run it, I'm going to get stuff as undefined, because remember, I need to have our libraries available, so I need to have the script manager in the page. Now, if we go look at that script, it looks a little worse, but first what I've done is register a namespace. Okay, again, an object-oriented concept that we just want to borrow from the .NET framework. So these kind of thing is just, you'll see things like type and sys, same kind of things you expect from the .NET framework. We've just brought them over. So I register a namespace called Microsoft. Again, I have Microsoft.person function name. I have the same get name prototype. Now here's where I say I'm going to register the class. So now I've told the AJAX library that I have this Microsoft.person type. It will now take care of things like matching up the namespace, checking for me, and in debug versions will do type checking for me. It'll do inheritance checking for me as we do that kind of thing in another example. Now I can new it up and call it just like I did before, and I get other things like being able to do base class library type functions like object get me the name of the type. So if we run that one, with just adding use of the AJAX library, I start to get a lot more facilities that just make regular client-side programming easier. Hey, it's a Microsoft.person type. I didn't have to do anything more. I just start getting a bunch of functionality like this just because I'm using ASP.NET AJAX. And then, not that you might be doing huge amounts of inheritance and this kind of thing. We almost got through one demo without my driver going nuts. Come on back.
Wow.
Yeah. Come on.
So should we switch back to my box? Looks like we're no longer getting a signal from yours.
1 second into the, if it doesn't go back in 10 seconds to see if
Okay.
it's connect it, detecting.
There's my box. I think this is a sign, huh?
Yeah, we'll post the code. So the next example would have shown you that you can do inheritance, but you follow that same pattern every time where you create the type and then you register at the end. The one thing about that really confuses people is that in all other languages, you declare up front that I'm inheriting from this type, and then here's everything I'm doing with it. And in all the JavaScript stuff, you're declaring everything that you're going to do, and then at the end, you're saying, now I'm registering with the system. And that's because you need to build up the type and then tell the AJAX type system, this is what I'm doing. So,
cool. So let me segue what Matt told you into what I'm going to show you here. If you think back to that architecture diagram we looked at the very beginning, there were a couple of blocks in it labeled script core library and base class library. Those are class libraries, but wait a minute. They're written in JavaScript, and yet JavaScript doesn't support OOP. You can't build classes in JavaScript. You can't derive one class from another. You can't override methods. What these guys have done, using the pattern that Matt just showed you, is they've injected OOP into JavaScript in the Microsoft AJAX library, which is the name we use to refer to the client half of ASP.NET AJAX. So if you can grok what he showed you there, how you use prototype to simulate classes in JavaScript, how you use methods in the type class in the Microsoft AJAX library to register namespaces, register classes and things, you can go through the JS files that make up this library, and you can understand 99% of what's in there. But there's more. There are a couple of reasons we wanted to show you this. One is it's kind of cool to know how the Microsoft AJAX library does OOP in JavaScript. But there's a practical application for that as well, and I'm going to show you one of those. In the ASP.NET AJAX extensions, at least in the future CTP, there is a little control called the drag overlay extender. Some of you may have used that control. You simply declare it on a web page, attach it to another control, maybe an ASP.NET panel control on the page, And that control becomes floatable. The user can take it, move it around the page, reposition it with the mouse. Now, under the hood, all that drag overlay extender is doing is emitting a single line of JavaScript that creates and initializes a client-side class named floating behavior. The problem with both drag overlay extender and floating behavior is that they don't allow you to build real drag-and-drop browser-based interfaces. They allow items to be floated by the user. They give you no control over where the items are positioned. They don't fire events, for example, when a drop occurs. There's no way to provide feedback through the cursor to the user whether you would accept the drop if it occurred right now. And yet, in the Microsoft AJAX library, there is a little file named preview-drag-drop.js. That's the file where floating behavior is implemented, but floating behavior is just one small part of that file. There is a much richer set of infrastructure in the file that does allow us to build very rich browser-based drag-and-drop interfaces, as I'm about to demonstrate. The reason we wanted to show you that OOP pattern Matt just demonstrated is that in order to do what we're doing right here, we had to build classes of our own that derive from classes in the Microsoft AJAX library and do it all in JavaScript. So here is true drag and drop in a browser. Now, to make it as simple as possible, I have some color swatches that are drag sources. When I drag them out, notice right now the cursor is telling me this isn't a drop zone, so I would not accept a drop if it occurred right now. But I've made this panel at the bottom of the page a drop target. Notice the cursor now tells me, yes, I'll accept a drop if it occurs. You even notice the drag highlighting we're doing. Notice how that panel changed background colors when the cursor entered it with a payload. When I drop it, the data is transferred from the drag source to the drop target, and the drop target assumes the drag source's color. And we can do it with other colors as well. In fact, I can sit here and do this all day. I just love doing this right here. Now, how do we build? Now, imagine this. You could take this simple example. Suppose you're building a photo sharing application or something like that. You allow your users to manage their photos online, but you want to give them a nice, easy-to-use drag-and-drop interface for moving photos from one album to another or deleting photos from the album. It would be so much better to do it this way than to do it in the traditional ways we do it with the web. The question is, what did it take to do what we did right here? Well, let me give you a quick look at that. I won't go through all the code because we want to make sure we get through all the demos, but I want you to look at a file named colordragdrop.js, which is in my scripts library, and yes, we will make these demos available. If you look through this JS file, you'll find that we have written two classes in JavaScript. One class is named color drag source behavior. This is the one that we attach to DOM elements to turn them into drag sources. Those color swatches that I was dragging, by the way, were nothing more than divs in HTML. The other class that we're deriving is one named color drop target behavior. I can new up an instance of this, attach it to a DOM element like a div, and that div or DOM element now becomes a valid drop target. In fact, before we walk through that code really, really quickly, let me show you how easy it was to use these classes. If you look down at the bottom of the page itself, you'll see that I'm newing up 5 color drag source behaviors. And as I'm doing it, I'm attaching them to divs, ordinary DOM elements, with the IDs that you see right here. That's all it took once these classes were built to turn those divs into draggable drag sources. In order to make that div at the bottom a drop target, all we had to do was new up a color drop target behavior and pass it the ID of the DOM element, in this case a div, that we want to be the drop target. Again, you could use this once the classes are built. It becomes trivially easy to turn DOM elements into drag sources and drop targets. If you choose to go through this JS file on your own, let me just point out a couple of highlights for you. In order to build this color drag source behavior class, if you go down to the bottom, you'll see that we derived from a built-in class built into the Microsoft AJAX library called sys.ui.behavior. That is the base class that allows us to attach behaviors like drag behaviors to DOM elements. I also implemented in this class an interface named iDragSource. Not only can we do namespaces and classes and derivation and stuff in the Microsoft AJAX library, there are interfaces defined in it. We can implement those interfaces. Most of the methods in this class that I derived are methods of the iDrag source interface. It's really that's making that DOM element a drag source. Same goes for the color drop target behavior class. We derived from sys.ui.behavior, and we also implemented in it the iDrop target interface. Now, little clue here. If any of you remember Olay drag and drop back in the old days. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, Olay didn't do many things right, but the one thing it did right was drag and drop. Back in those days, the model that we used was in Olay, if you implemented iDrag source on an object, that's how you made an object a drag source. Conversely, if you implemented iDrop target on an object, that object acted as a drop target. The Olay runtime provided the glue that allowed drop targets and drop sources to communicate. The same thing is happening here. Inside preview drag drop.js is a little class named _drag drop manager, which is a very rich JavaScript implementation of everything that you need to glue these drag sources and drop targets together. Now, I wish I had the time, I wish we had the time to go through this line for line, but if this is interesting to you, take a look at the sample, pay particular attention to color drag drop.js, where we use the pattern that Matt presented to you to extend the Microsoft AJAX library and add some cool new features. And with that, let's go back to your box. Do you think it's going to work now?
Should for a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think
All
we're
right.
there.
All right, one quick thing before we move on. As Jeff pointed out, the couple of patterns we began to show, you have all of the files, we drop them right on disk. It's also interesting to know, we release a zip file that has our JavaScript files in it because these libraries are fully supported without running ASP.NET on an IIS web server. You can actually use these on the server platform of your choice, which is IIS. But if you want to use them somewhere else, then they're there. And we release debug as well as crunched other released versions of them. So you should, now that you've seen kind of some of the patterns, you can, like in this version of Microsoft Web Forms debug.js, you can walk through them and see, we register the Web Forms namespace. Here's the begin request event args class, and you can walk right through. If you have questions about how stuff is happening, you can walk right through and see how it is, right down to where the type is registered. And also, how many people here are familiar with the ASP.NET forums on the ASP.NET site? Must be more than that. All right. For those of you who are not, then check out our website, www.asp.net, and there's a sub area there called the forums. And the team is regularly on there, as well as lots of other people who are using ASP.NET regularly, and it is a great place to get questions answered and share stuff you've found, and also share feedback with us. So if you start looking at this stuff and have questions, let us know. Okay. In this example, we have the drop-down list watermark extender. What this class does is extends from the extender control base. So the extender control base is in a shared source project that we have called the AJAX Control Toolkit, where you can get all the source and take a look at it. You can contribute. It's from a group, started from a group at Microsoft. They've done a couple of sessions here. Really sharp team. We actually even call them the agility team. They are quick, responsive, and seem to keep cranking out very cool UI controls. So you can extend from that. The key thing with the extenders is the model is you can take an existing ASP.NET control and you can extend its behavior. You don't have to inherit from the control, start writing necessarily new designers, start worrying about modifying view state and this kind of thing for the original control. You can just add to it directly. You can add multiple extender controls to a single existing control. So in this case, we have a drop-down list. You can take a look at it. Request a page. We get this drop-down list. Notice that it says select one. The behavior here is this is the watermark that we want to have for the drop-down list. And once you select something, we no longer want it to tell you that select one is an option. So it's just going to have the elements that are options to select. So in the page itself, custom extender, you can see that we have the drop-down list, and in the extender, we have that it's added that text through adding this drop-down list watermark extender. But it hasn't had to modify the existing drop-down list. It's just extending the behavior. So it's set that watermark text. So we see that on the server, it's straightforward. It simply sets that it has some client state that it wants to be able to track. And then in the client JavaScript file, it has watermark text that it initializes. It checks for that client state in order to tell postback state. It adds a change handler. This is another thing to point out here is for a lot of really common things that you're going to need to do in JavaScript, like add a handler to a DOM element, we've created a few shortcuts. We've tried to really walk the line here between having so many of these, they're hard to keep track of, but having a few that you use all the time. So things like getting an element by ID, locating elements, adding handlers, then we've had a few of these shortcuts where it's just dollar notation for something. So he adds the watermark to it. We have semantics like disposing of things, so you can make sure you're not leaking things in the user's browser. And then simply removes it once they've selected it. And you can see here that all that's happening to add it is to insert that watermark text in front of it. So creating extenders and adding them to controls doesn't become this very complicated task of trying to understand everything an existing control is doing, all the JavaScript it's rendering, all the view state it's managing. You can extend behavior pretty quickly. And with that, running out of time for questions, so we should move on to Q&A.
Okay. So actually, can I do one like 2-minute thing real quick? Is that cool?
Yeah.
I'll make it fast. If we can switch back to the XP box, let me show you one of my favorite demos here, and I will make this fast because we want to reserve 15 minutes or so for Q&A. What Matt just showed you was an example of how you can build custom controls of your own using the ASP.NET AJAX control toolkit. Why is that interesting? Because maybe instead of working with raw JavaScript like I was doing, you would like to take that logic, that intelligence, and encapsulate it in a server-side control so that other people on your team and in your company can easily just drag and drop that extender out there, and then it will emit all of that JavaScript. So to a large extent, building custom ASP.NET AJAX controls using the control toolkit is a way to put a layer of abstraction around the kind of stuff you saw me doing with those JavaScript interfaces and JavaScript classes a few moments ago. Now, let me say this. One of the controls in the ASP.NET AJAX control toolkit today is one called Animation Extender. We used it a lot on the Burton site to do fancy mouse overs and have images fade in and fade out and all kinds of things like that. And in fact, for me personally, it's become one of the most useful controls in the toolkit. However, there's one problem with the Animation Extender, and that is, we've been telling people for a year now, you don't have to be an ASP.NET developer to use this framework. The client half of Microsoft ASP.NET AJAX, remember, is just JavaScript, and it works just as well from a PHP page or a Cold Fusion page as it does an ASP.NET AJAX page. So what if I'm a PHP developer and I want to do cool animations in my page? I can't use that animation extender control from the toolkit because it is ASP.NET specific. But guess what? Another one of those little JavaScript files on the client that makes up the Microsoft AJAX library is one called previewglitz.js. Now, it too is part of the future CTP, so it's not part of the core. But we find inside it basically all of the logic that allows Animation Extender to work. And if we're willing to deal with those JavaScript classes in previewglitz.js, we can do everything that those snooty ASP.NET guys can when they're dragging and dropping animation extenders, right? So, now I wish I actually had this running in PHP, but I don't. But let me show you another one of my favorite little demos. It's one where sometimes I've been known to just get lost for hours. When you click these balloons, they pop. Isn't that cool? In fact, let's refresh that and do it again. Just make sure it works the way it's supposed to. Version 2, Matt and I are thinking about putting multicolored balloons in here.
But I think you should be able to drag the color on so that you pick the color and then pop it.
Sounds like a good job for the ASP.NET AJAX team to me.
But it'd be preview glitz first so we could get feedback.
Yeah, there you go. Let me just show you real briefly what it took to do this, because it wasn't that bad. First, let me show you this page. I do have, just for reference and for comparisons, the same page implemented using the Control Toolkit's animation extender. And one of the cool things about that extender is that it allows you to work at a pretty high level. You can see here I'm using ASP.NET image controls for the balloons. I'm declaring an animation extender control from the toolkit. And it allows me to do cool things like define animations that are going to run in parallel or in sequence, making it really easy for me to compose complex animations from more nuclear animations. The only downside to doing this without the toolkit, when I go it on my own with those classes written in JavaScript and previewglitz.js, is I don't have this high level of support. I don't have little XML elements named parallel. So the code isn't quite as clean and pretty. But if you look at clientanimation.aspx, and again, I won't walk through it all, but I want to make you aware of it, you'll see how PHP and Cold Fusion developers can do fancy animations like this as well. This function named popBalloon is the one that we call when you click the mouse over the balloon. Now, there are basically here several animations I want to run in parallel. Notice I'm newing up a number of number animation objects. Number animation is one of several JavaScript classes defined in previewglitz.js. This allows me to animate or change the value of a numeric property on some object over time. I'm newing up 4 of them because I want to simultaneously scale up the width and the height of that balloon image. And oh, by the way, I also have to be changing its X and Y upper left corner coordinates so that as it scales, it doesn't appear to move. I want to keep it centered. So I knew up all those little number animations and also a fade animation because as we zoom that image up to make it appear to pop, we're also fading it out. We're running its opacity from 1 to 0. Now, because there is no parallel element, what I do is create a composite animation object, add all of the little animations that I created to the composite animation, tell the framework that I want all of this to run over a duration of 0.2 seconds, frame rate of 40 frames per second, and play. Now, one other little thing. If you've used the animation extender control in the toolkit, you're familiar with its sequence element, which lets you run animations sequentially. There's no such thing in previewglitz.js. So what I had to do, because this is asynchronous, it returns immediately, I set a timer here to check after 400 milliseconds, and if needed, after another 400 milliseconds. I check here to see if all the animations in that composite animation have finished. If the answer is yes, then I physically remove that balloon image from the browser DOM so that it goes away and can't be clicked again. Now, it's not as easy this way as with Animation Extender, but if you're a PHP person, Cold Fusion person, or whatever, there's a lot of magic, a lot of great stuff in the other JS files that make up the client-side library. Now, with that, I'll shut up. We wanted to reserve about 15 minutes for questions. We have almost 7 minutes. You'll notice there's a microphone in the aisle here. If you have some questions, we'd love to field them. If you don't mind, step up to the microphone. That way, everyone can hear you. First question. Yes, sir.
Jeff, you talked about the update panel and how you can only have 1 request active at a time. Any subsequent request from any other button clicks will automatically cancel existing requests. Is that a limitation because of the view state that's being passed around, or?
So the effect is that the user, it's effectively canceled, but in reality, what happens is the return from that request is ignored.
Right.
So the reason is that it's not going to juggle the return value and try to do something productive with it since a new request is being initiated. So it closes the channel, and you can get the balanced effect that the server for long-running requests will check if something's been in the queue before being processed, and will check to see if the channel's been closed, and then terminate processing there before beginning the request. So It's not really view state related as much as it's, hey, we're not going to send it back if nobody's listening for it anymore.
Okay. You also have the ability to, you have web services now. You can expose them through JavaScript proxies. What are the security implications of that, and are there any best practices out there of, anyone can call that web service and say, in your example, I forgot what, you can make a request and get that. So what we do right now is we have a hidden field on the page, and we have a session object, and we compare those values. But if something like that were built in, it would be easier for developers not to have to worry about, exposing the web services.
Yeah, there's a few things, and we can get you a pointer to a couple of them. Scott Guthrie has a blog entry that points to a few of these.
Okay.
There was recently an article, actually a very unfair article, that went through a bunch of different AJAX frameworks, and in most cases got them wrong, including the AJAX framework. By default, we don't respond to anything but post requests for the proxy invocations, and you'd have to enable them for GET, which provides one just complication out of the box. You have to enable specific methods to be called, so you don't just enable everything by default by installing AJAX. You have to go specifically say, I want this web service enabled, and there's a couple other things you can do. We should probably look at ways to make it easier. The other thing that we've looked at doing is making it easier to do a key token kind of pairing. It sounds like what you're doing as well. We probably have some room for improvement there. Okay. The biggest fear people have had has not been so much on people invoking them just directly. It's been on getting people to invoke them on the behalf of someone else.
Yeah, cross-site scripting.
Yeah, okay. And we've got really good coverage there, and we're actually looking at adding one more mitigation that it's a little bit of a perf hit, but it looks like it's worth it, in that right now we return the JSON directly, and you can wrap that in a token, a little wrapper that makes it not JSON anymore, and you have to strip that off first and then get the JSON out. It provides one more layer of protection so that nobody can just eval the response if they could actually accomplish a cross-site script invocation of it. But in terms of identity, ensuring the identity, we don't provide out-of-the-box a way to do it right now. We've really been more focused on the don't let somebody else invoke it on my behalf.
Right, okay. One last question, and
Sure.
I'll shut up.
Sure.
Add handler and remove handler, are you using closures for that?
Add handler for the closures directly? I'd have to look.
Okay.
I'll find out.
Okay.
And then I can give me your email address, and I can send you directly, and then I can post it on my blog for other people to follow up on.
I don't believe so. But
It's very few things we actually use a closure for, so I would be surprised, but I'll double check.
Okay, the situation we're running into is button in an update panel, just a standard input type equals button. And then we're using register client script block. But the block is being created at the end. Of course, as the update panel renders, the button is available for people to click on before the script block is actually instantiated, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Results in JavaScript exception. Any way that we can force the script block to be there before we're able to actually call it from within the update panel?
Yep. There's a property, I'll have to look it up. There's a property you can set where and it's some funny name. It's it's basically like if you had to dream up the name of what you would call that. It's render inline before script or something.
It's a script manager property, right?
Yeah, and you just force it to do it. Another one I'll have to look up. So hang around for a second. I'll take a couple notes and get things to follow up with people. But yeah, we had a lot of debate of if we should change the default for it, and decided not to. But there's a way you can make it happen.
Okay. With respect to the out-of-band calls, in a web control scenario, what is the best practice for doing so? And to be more specific, so the situation I've run into is that on pages we use the static page methods, and then it generates a proxy and we call it. But when you're dealing with web controls, that's not available to you because you're not a page. So in terms of redistributable controls, what's the best way to make out-of-band calls?
Out-of-band calls for accessing stuff on the web control itself?
Right. So for example, the zip code scenario, you want to be able to pass the zip code to the control and bring back a city name. without deploying ASMX files.
So you essentially want to instantiate just the web control without doing a postback for the page. You want to.
Well, let's say I have 10 websites, right, and they all have an address control on them. I don't want to have to deploy that ASMX file to all 10 websites, and there are reasons why I can't sort of point them centrally. So, if there are pages, what I'd like to do is use the static page methods and just call that. But as a web control, you can't include that with the web control.
Yeah. There isn't really a clean way right now to extract from a web control across websites and say there's not even a great way on a single web page to say I want to access something in a control as though it were static.
I guess what I'd almost be looking for is the similar ability that you can define those web methods on a page to also be able to define them in a control and be able to call them.
Yeah, sort of the control equivalent of page methods is what you're looking for.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're page methods, but there aren't control methods per se.
Yeah, and even that, it's static page methods.
That's right. So you don't have to run the page through a lifetime, right? By the
Yeah.
way, the name of that property, got it with IntelliSense, load scripts before UI.
There it is. Load
Yeah.
scripts before UI. We're looking for VNext kind of stuff at lightweight controls where you can essentially have kind of like a user control where you say that the life cycle of the page doesn't matter, but I don't have a good answer for you now for it, and we're just looking at prototyping that kind of thing now. So I don't have a great answer for you. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sure you know this, the way Autocomplete Extender does it now, it internally creates, programmatically creates a service reference back to the web service that is the service that you pointed to. So yeah, that would be cool to have something like that in the next version.
Yeah, the deployment, it's like you say, the deployment is where it comes down to, like, I want the encapsulation of a control. I don't want to have to split off an ASMX that corresponds to my control and have them kept together. So, yeah.
What's the theory behind the $sign notation? I've never seen it before in JavaScript.
Behind the what in JavaScript?
$sign notation, $sign prefix.
Oh, the dollar sign.
In front of methods. Like define, basically?
Yeah, what is the history on that?
Preprocessor?
Yeah, I think it kind of came down to what was available and what was legal and what would parse for other things. I mean, it's like in how we ended up with the digraph for classic ASP. I mean, it was just something that was, if you didn't have a squirrely bracket on some old parsers, then the digraph that was used there was an available substitute, so we just borrowed it. The dollar was just available and didn't cause any conflicts that we could find. So
I see. So there's no special, basically, syntax behind that.
nope, it
Just
was
the
just
character you wanted to
acceptable
use.
syntax that we liked.
What's the tool you use to view the HTTP traffic?
I was using
Oh, the one?
earlier demo.
Web Development Helper. It was written by Nikhil Katari, who's a software architect on this team. You go to his blog, or I think it's nikhilk.net, and you find a link for it. But it's a wonderful tool for doing ASP.NET AJAX development, and it is
Spelled
free.
with a C
also.
or what is it?
NIKHILK.net.
K-A.
nikhilk.net.
NIKHILK.net.
It's too bad his name isn't Smith. So let's do one more question, and then we've actually overstayed our time. We'll do this one last one, and if any of you have additional questions, Matt and I will be glad to hang around as we tear down and walk out in the hall with you and get them taken care of. Yes, sir.
So when you have a page that does multiple asynchronous web service requests, do you
Sorry,
do
Matt.
any kind
Louder?
of...
I couldn't hear you.
Sorry. When you have a page that does multiple asynchronous web service requests, do you do any kind of queuing so that you don't starve the browser threads? Or?
If you're doing multi-call stuff. In earlier builds, we actually had multiplexing and demultiplexing of them, and the feedback we had was, this is just too confusing. So right now, what we have is this cancel model where if you get multiples of them, we queue them up, and you don't end up actually starving threads. You end up just queuing them up and invoking them as they go. All the browsers right now limit you to 2 open threads of communication back to the server, and so you don't end up with a thread starvation issue. You just end up with queued requests or canceled requests.
They are queued, right? They are queued.
Yeah. So, well, you can choose to cancel too. You can tie in there and say, I'm going to do my own priority management, and you can throw requests out and say, based on your own set of logic. But you don't end up with thread starvation. You just end up with queues or canceled.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming. Hope you found it useful. And if you have additional questions, look for us up front or outside. We'll be glad to help you out. Thank you very much.
Thanks.